Welcome to Foureyes Furniture. I'm Chris, and today we're going to spring a leak, lose power, and hopefully build a really nice table. Let's get to it. Love it or hate it, Walnut is the GOAT. So it might surprise you to learn that I've never worked with a walnut slab. But a couple weeks back, we went on the hunt and eventually stumbled across this beauty on the GL Veneer website. And even though it was split in half due to a giant crack, we decided to give it a shot and take her home. And just like I've never worked with a walnut slab before, I've also never worked with a rough sawn slab. And honestly, it's not really that different, other than that rough slabs are quite a bit dirtier. So we started off with some brushing and blowing to remove the bulk of the caked on dirt, but eventually that wasn't aggressive enough, so we switched over to a nylon brush in a drill. And as you can tell from these shots, we haven't cut the straps on the slab yet at this point, which was probably dumb on our part. But if you're wondering why that is, it's because we wanted to get some potential thumbnail photos that were post cleanup but pre-strap cut, which was going to be a very small window. But eventually we wisened up and cut the straps. And actually that's not even true. We were kind of forced into it at this point. And that's because we needed to be able to move things around to figure out the layout of the slabs for the dining table. And while doing that, after a little preliminary brainstorming, we pretty quickly realized that we were going to need a layout frame. And I don't think that this shot does a good job of visually explaining what we were thinking and talking about here. So I'm going to draw it and try to explain it better. So we're going for a rectangular table, not a live edge. But we were thinking we might get creative and maybe, rotate our frame and get this portion of the table from this section of wood, then take an offcut and kind of nest it down here on the other side. But with this one, it felt like we were doing that just for the sake of doing it, and actually prefer the way that it looks like this. And with all of the cracks and the holes, it's already going to look rough enough, so no need to gild the lily. Which, by the way, if you're not familiar with that phrase, gilding the lily, basically it means to unnecessarily try to improve something. And I feel like it's a term that needs a modern update, so how about no need to put ranch on the pizza, maybe? Point is, lilies don't need gilding. Pizza doesn't need ranching, and this slab doesn't need extra cutting. And if you've got a better modern update for that phrase, leave it in the comments. Something else new about working with rough slabs is that they're thicker than surface slabs. This one, for example, was about 3 inches thick, which meant that none of our saws had the cut capacity to reach all the way through. So I guess lesson learned on this one. And actually, I was talking to the guy at GL Veneer, Dan, and he was telling me that they have a pretty fancy machine for slab flattening. I'll see if I can get him to send me some footage that I can put in right here. And either way, next time I will definitely take them up on that service. And actually, I'm going to throw a link to their site in the description so that if anybody's interested, they can poke around and browse their inventory, see if there's anything they like. Anyway, all of that is to say with this one, we had to just cut as deep as we could and then resort to other methods for getting rid of the last 1/8 inch or so that we couldn't reach with the saw. And this doesn't really leave the prettiest edge, but that doesn't matter right now since we're leaving everything oversized. Now, here we ran into a legitimate problem. You can see that this slab has a really big bow in it, which we thought was fine because it's still way thicker than it's going to need to be in the end. But when we took it to get flattened on a wide belt sander, after sending it through a few times, it was actually too much for the sander to handle and we had to stop. So we weren't really sure what we were going to do. But thankfully I was in the neighborhood already and I decided to pay Big John a visit. And thankfully he was able to throw it on their WoodWiz, which is kind of like flattening on a CNC. Except that instead of having like an 1.5 inch diameter cutting head, it has a 6-inch cutting head. And instead of being controlled by a computer in G-code, it's controlled by Big John. Needless to say, he really bailed us out here. Every now and then we'll get a comment from somebody saying that they're disappointed that we're making a lot of slab projects now. And on our last video, we got one where the person basically said that they hope that this is just a phase and that we'll quickly get back to the woodworking and design that made them such a fan. Now, I'm not complaining. It was actually a very respectful back and forth that we had. But anyway, here's the gist of how I replied to that, and I'm interested to hear your opinions. So this was on the modern desk video. Here's what it looked like if you missed that one. And I said that I legitimately don't understand that critique And I don't know how you can look at that piece or watch that video and say that there's not enough woodworking and design there. In my mind, the only difference between that and the old way we would have done it is that instead of using a slab, we'd make a panel top. And honestly, as the person who's gone through the labor of both of those processes several times now, I can tell you that making a slab top involves way more quote unquote woodworking than making a panel does. Now, I'm about to be very blunt, so I hope that you'll appreciate the honesty, even though I'm sure we'll get some backlash. But the thing that prompted this change in direction was that, for lack of a better way to put it, we're not satisfied with where we are. And I hope you don't take that the wrong way. It doesn't mean that we're not appreciative of the success that we've had. But when I read a comment where somebody's telling me that a video was one of the best woodworking videos that they've seen on YouTube, I don't think, oh, awesome, we're on the right track. I think, then why don't our views back that up? And I'm not saying that we're the best and we deserve the most views, but we don't want to make a video that 50,000 people love. We want to make a video that 1 million people love. And that doesn't mean that we need to abandon our style and those first 50,000 people. It means that we need to grow and evolve our style to find those other 950,000 people. So if you're a longtime viewer, don't worry. All of the woodworking and design that you've come to expect from us is still going to be there. But we're trying to go big. And maybe that's an unhealthy way to think, but it's the truth. All right. The hardest part of these projects, or at least where I feel like we struggle the most, isn't figuring out the layout of the slabs. It's not building a watertight form. It's not even getting a good high quality finished result. And this might sound really stupid, but it's actually figuring out how much epoxy any given pour is going to need. So I mentioned this in the last video, but a lot of you recommended that we check out BLACKTAIL Studios' epoxy workshop, which we did. And in it, he's got a chapter where he goes over his method for calculating this, which I think strikes the perfect balance between doing some sort of elaborate water displacement experiment and completely not giving a. That said, we're not doing that. And that's because a couple chapters later, he mentions the idea of having a backup project, basically a useful place that you can dump your extra epoxy. And we decided to take that idea to the extreme. So we've had this one cooking for a couple months now, and you'll probably see it in a video either later this year or sometime next year. Now, speaking of the actual epoxy itself, we're using a product from Total Boat called Fathom Thickset. And in the past, whenever we've used it, we've had to wait about 48 hours between pours. But one of the upsides of it currently being 105 degrees is that by the next morning, it was cured enough that we could do our second pour. So I guess the upside is it's like having a kiln, but the downside is you live in the kiln. Quick tangent. Our drill's supposed to do this. That clank you hear is the chuck loosening when the drill stops. And it never caused me a huge issue in the past, but this time it did force me to have to go fishing for my epoxy stirrer. Anyway, and as you can see here, I definitely fell on the not giving a side of the spectrum with this pour and mixed up way too much epoxy. But honestly, this time it was intentional. I figured if I kept doing pours like that last one on our extra epoxy project, there's no way that it would be ready by 2023, let alone 2033. Also, a fly decided to off himself in that last pour, and I wanted to be able to give him the proper burial that he deserved. Taking the slabs out of the form has become the most nerve-wracking, but also kind of most exciting part of a build for me. And that's because we've had our share of issues in the past, but as a veteran of 5 of these projects now, I'm going to claim that just tape is plenty for getting things to not stick, which is ironic. And you don't need to take my word for it because, as you can see here, this one popped off super easy. No need for chisels or crowbars or anything like that. Even Dolores was impressed. Maybe not. But anyway, as you can see behind me here, that base piece is still in great condition for the next project, so very little waste doing it this way. Actually, here's another pro tip, or maybe this one's a PSA. Dust collection and epoxy dust collection are 2 very different things. As I was making this cut, I discovered that. So I decided to take the cover of my track saw off and sure enough, I had a big epoxy noodle clog. So I guess the message here is, if you can avoid cutting through pure epoxy, do that. But if you can't, just expect clogs. Either way, with the slab nice and dry and cut into an oversized rectangle, it was back to the wide belt sander once more, and it seemed like all of our troubles were finally behind us. Until the next morning when I walked into our shop and discovered the roof leaking. Thankfully, by pure randomness, no water got on any of our tools, so crisis averted. Now, I know the main reason that people watch these videos is for entertainment purposes, followed closely by background noise to fall asleep to. But I know that there is a small handful of people watching for information. So for those people, I want to try to give one blatant woodworking tip in each video. And in this one, I want to talk about how I cut out large rectangles that I think gives me the best chance for nice square corners. And I know this sounds really simple and obvious, but here's what I do. Start by cutting one of your long edges, not a short edge. Then measure the width you want and mark it on both ends of your top and make your second cut as a parallel line. Then use a square to set up a cross cut and cut both ends to whatever length you want. And I think that the reason that this is better is because it eliminates the compounding of errors. So let's use an extreme example where you would be using a square that's off by 1 degree. Instead of 90 degrees, it's 89. So a lot of people will cut out a rectangle like this instead. And if they did, here's what they'd end up with versus what they'd get by cutting it the way that I did. Again, this is an extreme example and it's an oversimplified explanation, but it's something to think about. And no, I did not learn that one from the BLACKTAIL epoxy course. So Cam, if you want to throw that gem into version 2, she's all yours. Though honestly, what he should add is a chapter where he teaches people how to flip slabs the right way, because clearly I was having some trouble with that. Which is kind of off brand for me because I do consider myself sort of a man's man. Just kidding. But actually that does kind of bring up an interesting topic. Stay with me. So while I don't consider myself a man's man by any means, Sean neither, I'm sure he won't be offended by that. I do think that most of the furniture we build, or at least where we naturally gravitate when designing, is a bit more on the quote-unquote masculine side. And what I mean by that is basically modern minimalist angular pieces. So I guess my first question is, why is modern furniture considered masculine? With this one, and I know you haven't seen the full design yet, but even just seeing what we're doing here, which is making these large radiuses in the corners, we're going for a very different, much more rounded and soft look. And I don't think it's necessarily a feminine aesthetic either. If anything, I would say it's probably neutral. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of weird to think of furniture as masculine and feminine. And by the way, when I say that, I don't mean it in a stereotypical way. Like when I say masculine furniture, I don't mean a baseball glove seat and a moose head. And by feminine furniture, I don't mean a pink makeup vanity with a fluffy stool. I mean it in a more nuanced way. Like for example, for whatever reason, modern minimalist furniture is seen as masculine, and something like farmhouse country furniture is seen as feminine. And I think both are great styles and totally acceptable for anybody to like. And honestly, if you build stuff that falls anywhere in this range, like 95% of people are going to be your potential customer. And while I don't think we're going to be making the full-on leap to the Joanna Gaines aesthetic anytime soon, or ever, I guess with this one, maybe we're just trying to slide a couple tick marks to the right. Anyway, I'm getting way off topic here, so to bring it back, in these shots I'm just cutting in grooves for some C-channel. And sometimes we'll get questions about this, mainly people asking if it's for strength, and the short answer is no. The table's going to be plenty strong without it, and the actual purpose is future-proofing the slab against any potential cupping, bending, or twisting. That kind of stuff. And we're just going to cut the grooves at this point, but we won't actually install these until later. For now, we just want to make sure that they fit nice. All right, here we're going to try something new for us, and that is doing a brass inlay detail along the bottom perimeter of the table. So here Sean has a 6x6 plate of brass, and he's using the CNC to cut out 4 of these little J shapes. And we're making these perfectly match the radiuses that we cut onto the corners a couple minutes ago. Then he's also going to take some brass strips and we'll attach those to the little J's to make big J's. And to attach them, he's going to do some soldering. Now, I've literally never soldered a single thing in my entire life, and I think Sean has only ever soldered for function, as in like electronics, but not for aesthetics like he is here. So I'm sure those of you who know how to solder and are watching this are probably wishing you could reach through the screen right now and grab the torch from Sean and say, "Let me show you how to do that." But unfortunately, technology isn't there yet. And for those of you who actually do want to learn how to solder, fortunately, you're on YouTube right now, so easy. Now, you also might be asking yourself, why are the J's so long in one direction and so short on the other? And as you're going to see, the brass doesn't go all the way around the entire perimeter, but kind of like this instead. And the reason for that is that wood expands and contracts this way across the width. So if we did try to do a full perimeter, during the year, the top is going to change, but the brass isn't. And something's got to give and the brass is going to break apart. But doing it the way Sean is doing it here, we've basically got 4 independent pieces that can freely move with the table, regardless of where in the world the table is or what season it is. Okay, I've got a confession. That power outage that we had a couple minutes back was fake. And I'll explain why we did that in a minute, though I'm sure you'll put it all together before I even have to. But in any case, let's take a minute to thank this video's sponsor, EcoFlow, for sending us out their new Delta 2 to try out. So you might think that the Delta 2 is just a battery, but it's actually a lot more than that. I guess the best way to describe it is a portable, lightweight power station that you can take anywhere to power pretty much anything. And while it is small and light, its 1800 watt output lets you power all of your family's devices simultaneously and even keep your largest, most essential appliances running during a blackout with no fear of overloading thanks to EcoFlow's X-Boost technology. On top of that, it's the fastest charging power station on the market. It can go from 0 to 80% in just 50 minutes and up to 100% in 80 minutes. Or if you're out camping or on the job site with limited power, you can even charge it using the optional portable solar panels and get up to 500 watts to charge in as little as 3 hours. And you can manage and control everything right from your phone using the EcoFlow app. So the reason that we cut power earlier is because we wanted to see what it would be like to actually have to rely on this thing. So we used it to cut our radiuses, cut our C-channel grooves, our notches for the brass, plus power some lights. And all told, it was over a solid day of woodworking. And even after that, it was still at 49% capacity. So honestly, I didn't think I was in the market for something like this. But after having it for a couple weeks now, it's awesome. I think I'm going to get way more use out of it than I would have imagined. And it's great to have around in the event of a power outage. And if you're into camping or something like that, I think it's a no-brainer. So check out their lineup. I've got a link in the description where you can find out more. And thank you again to EcoFlow. Okay, let's get back to the build. Now, a couple minutes ago when we cut our radiuses, you might have noticed that it exposed a bunch of tiny cracks. You can see those in this shot right here. So we needed to take care of those before we could move on. And once that was dry, Sean could install the brass for real by spreading some epoxy and screwing everything in. And then do some rough sanding to knock back any epoxy and clean up any discrepancies. All right, let's turn our attention to the base for a couple minutes. So like I mentioned, with this one, we decided to go for a very rounded and much more simplistic look. Though, as you're going to see while we work our way through actually building the base, a lot of the details and the fit and finish are actually really tricky. So I'm going to point out any of the obstacles and what our solutions were as we come across each one. So the legs are going to be a cylinder that tapers from a 4-inch diameter at the top to a 2-inch diameter at the bottom. So the first thing that we needed to do was create 4 leg blanks that are just slightly thicker and wider than 4 inches and about 30 inches long at this point. And we don't have access to any chunks of walnut that thick, so that meant gluing 2 pieces together to make each blank. From there, we can mark the center of each leg blank and draw a circle on the ends so that we can see the biggest part of our leg. And then we can use that mark as a guide to remove the corners of each leg blank so that when we go to turn these on the lathe, we're not removing quite as much material. So I know that the legs look really plain and simple, but once you get to this point, you're basically just sculpting as opposed to setting up cuts on a saw where you can be super accurate and precise. So for me, this is a lot harder, but I guess that depends on a person's particular skill set. Anyway, the workflow for these was to start by roughing things out to take a piece from an octagon to a cylinder. And then we made ourselves a couple of guides that we could use to dial in the largest and smallest parts of the leg, the top and the bottom. And then you just try your best to connect the two with as straight of a taper as you can. So once you've done that with one of them finished, the next challenge is to try to make 3 more that are as close to matching as possible. And there are definitely slight differences between any 2 of our legs, but it's one of those things where, yeah, it would be great if they were all perfectly matching, but at the end of the day, all that really matters is that they pass the eye test, and they definitely do. The next obstacle was figuring out how we were going to cut joints in the legs. So looking at the base design, again, you can see it's very simple. And if you were to look at one of these aprons from the end, they're going to look like this, where you've got a curved bottom. So that means that we need to cut a mortise with a round bottom to perfectly match the apron. And there are a lot of ways that we could have done this, but we decided to try cutting it on our CNC. So we made this jig that'll help us hold everything tightly and in the right orientation while we clear out the cut. So once we would clear out one, then we needed to rotate the piece as close to 90 degrees as possible to cut the second joint. And we couldn't really think of anything much more elaborate than eyeballing it with a square. But again, we got everything close enough to get the job done. In this shot, you can see that we have these 2 little shims here and here. And the reason for that is, again, no 2 legs are exactly the same. So we needed to set up each one so that we made sure we were cutting at the proper angle, which if you look at it from this view, you want that face that we're looking at to be perpendicular to the bed of the CNC so that we're drilling straight down into it. Now, I know that we could have come up with non-CNC ways to get this done, but honestly, this felt like the way that was going to give us the best result. And also, even using the CNC, this was by no means easy. But whenever you put a CNC in a video, it seems like you run the risk of getting comments from people telling you that you're not a real woodworker. So if seeing this makes you lose respect for us and you think we're just a couple of hacks, that's fine. All right, so even though we've cut the recesses where our aprons will go, we still have to actually make the aprons. And again, this was just a matter of milling up a bunch of oversized walnut strips. And in this case, we were going to need 6 total. 2 long ones that'll run the length of the table, 2 short ones that'll run the width, and 2 even slightly shorter ones that'll go at the center for extra support. And to make it so that we're not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, we used the router table with a 1/2-inch roundover bit to make the aprons U-shaped along the bottom, like you saw in that drawing a couple minutes ago. And actually, speaking of those drawings, do you find them helpful, enjoyable, distracting, or some other adjective? Honestly, tell me. I personally kind of have fun making them, but I can see where having too many could kind of pull you out of the action. But at the same time, I think that they can do a lot of explaining that's kind of hard to see in just shots of us cutting stuff. So let me know. All right, with everything cut to final size, before we could glue everything together, we needed to take care of a couple knot holes and cut the legs to their final length. Or I guess kind of sand them to their final length. And we knew that this glue up was going to be pretty messy, so we decided to bust out the Rockler project mats. And for this particular glue up, we did it in 3 phases. First, we glued together 2 pairs of legs with the short aprons. Next, we glued the 2 long aprons into a kind of ladder shape with the 2 stretchers. And then we could put the whole thing together. Being a YouTuber has a lot of perks. And I know I was kind of complaining earlier in the video, but I genuinely do love it. And I'm extremely grateful to get to do this. So one of the perks is that from time to time, brands or people will send us stuff. which is awesome. But I do think that sometimes viewers will think that we get everything for free, which is definitely not the case. Take the C channel that I'm installing here, for example. Bought and paid for it just the same as anybody else would. Funny story, actually. A week later, when we got it and opened it up, it had a postcard and a really nice note inside, which we really appreciate and totally don't deserve. And I don't know what the guy who sent its intentions were, or if he thought we were going to give him a shout out in the video or something, but I hate to break it to you, Shane, we're not doing it. So for anybody else that tries to get a bright idea and thinks we can be bought with their nice gestures or especially their money, forget about it. It's not happening. All right, at this point in the project, we're definitely on the home stretch, which is why the next step is such a gut check moment. Now, we knew we definitely wanted to put a large roundover on the top side of the table. The problem was we weren't sure how large. So we decided to play it cool and start with a 1/2 inch roundover. So Sean worked his way around the top in a couple passes to get to full depth. And after seeing it, we both agreed that it looked really great and we were happy with it. But we couldn't help but wondering, could a 3/4 inch roundover be better? I mean, that is pretty big, but we are going for a rounded look, so what do? We went for it. At the end of the day, while it would certainly suck quite badly to end up doing it and regretting it, because there is no going back, I think it would suck even more to not go far enough and wonder what could have been. Like at the end of your life, you're not going to sit there and regret the one time that you decided to have an ice cream sundae after dinner. You're going to think, damn, I should have had a sundae after every meal. Of course, if you did that, you'd be like 37 on that deathbed, but you get what I'm saying. And as luck would have it, we actually like the 3/4 inch roundover even more. So cherry on top. All right, here you can see that we've got a little problem. I'd say maybe an 1/8 of an inch problem or so. And I would like to say that there was an elegant solution, but there wasn't. But with the top nice and flat, we could finally put the top on the base, or I guess in this case it's the base on the top, to figure out exactly where it was going to be placed. And then to actually attach everything, we're going to use what are called table buttons. And you can see here what they look like. Basically, it's a block with a little tab extending off of it and a hole for a screw. And to make them, Sean took an offcut of walnut and cross-cut a few strips. Then he could cut a rabbet to create the tab extension. And then drilled and countersunk a few holes. And then finally cut them into individual buttons. And probably the main thing that you need to think about if you're doing something like this is that you want to make sure the grain is running lengthwise along the button and not across it, like you can see here. Otherwise, the tab is just going to get really weak and it might snap when you go to screw them in. Anyway, while Sean was doing that, I had grabbed the base and I used a domino to cut in a few mortises. And here I'm cutting the slots for the buttons that go along the long aprons to pretty much fit the button. But for the short aprons, I'm elongating them. And that's so that after the top is attached, it can expand and contract freely without breaking anything apart. Of all the technical questions that we get in our comments, far and away the most frequent questions have to do with finishing. And I think it's because people kind of hate finishing. And I get it, I'm right there with you. I hate finishing too. And anyway, I think that people are hoping that there's some kind of magic product out there that gives you perfect results and is insanely easy to apply. And the reality is, there isn't. That's why finishing sucks. So the most common of those questions is, what are you using? When it should probably be, what's your process? So I will tell you, this one is Rubio Monocoat. But I think it's actually kind of a disservice to answer like that because it makes it seem like it's a magic product. I think there's a saying that painters use, something like it's 90% prep work, 10% painting. So I think what I'll eventually do is just break down and make a here's how I finish video. That way I can just refer back to that video whenever people want to know. But because I know that people do like seeing this part, I'm just going to take this moment to say thank you for watching this video. Whether this is your first time, second time, or 19th time, We appreciate it and we thank you for it. And if you want to send that thanks back, hit the subscribe button, notification bell, or like button, or make it a hat trick and hit all three. And also, thank you to my new and returning Patreon members. I know I say it in every video, but seriously, thank you so much for all of the support that you've given me. And if anybody wants to find out more, grab a field notes booklet and a Foureyes t-shirt, and even get discounts on our woodworking plans, I'll throw a link in the description so you can check it out, see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. I started off this video by saying that Walnut is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And that wasn't my personal opinion, but rather the general opinion within the woodworking community, at least from what I've observed over the past 10 years. Basically, if you poll 1,000 woodworkers and ask them their favorite species of wood, you're going to get a lot of different answers, but I feel pretty confident that the most common answer is going to be walnut. As slabs go, it's dark, it's highly figured, and at least in my limited experience, it's easier to work with than other woods. So, does it deserve the title? In my opinion, no. And I think the three key words in that last sentence are, in my opinion. Goat debates are dumb because they try to take an opinion and present it as fact. And sure, with sports, you can try to back it up with stats to prove that Jordan was better than LeBron or vice versa. But at the end of the day, you can't just count rings and make a claim. And if you could, here's your greatest wood and basketball player of all time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.